I produced a couple of previous videos explaining the important distinction between absolute and relative risk. But in the light of continued confusion about this, especially with respect to the way the different types of risks are presented in discussions about COVID and vaccines, I think further explanation examples are needed. In the first example, I'll explain the simple difference between relative and absolute risk by looking at how a specific risk factor, obesity, is associated with increased risk of a specific disease, colorectal cancer. Now, although the numbers I'm going to use are illustrative, they are roughly based on real data. So we're going to compare non-obese and obese people. So first of all, we note that 2 out of every 100 non-obese people dies from colon cancer. It's quite a common cause of death. So we say that the absolute risk of a non-obese person dying from colon cancer is 2%, probability of 0.02. Now, among obese people, 3 out of 100 die of colon cancer, so the absolute risk is 3%. Now, although we cannot say obesity causes colon cancer, we can say that obese people have an increased risk of colon cancer. Now, as 3% is 50% greater than 2%, the relative risk increase of dying from colon cancer for obese people is 50%. And formally, we define, therefore, the relative risk as the percentage of people who die from colon cancer divided by the percentage of non-obese who die from colon cancer minus 1 times 100%. And there we see it applied in this case. But of course the absolute risk increase is only 1% because 1% more obese people than non-obese people die from colorectal cancer. And formally, absolute risk is simply the percentage of obese people who die from colorectal cancer minus the percentage of non-obese people who die from colorectal cancer. Now, a 1% absolute risk increase sounds a lot less concerning than a 50% increase if you're obese. So if all you're told is that the risk increase is X%, you really need to know if this is the absolute risk or relative risk. Major difference. So as far as relative risk is concerned, we can generalize what we just saw. In general, the relative increase in risk of some bad outcome, if a risk factor is present, is defined by this equation. The percentage with the risk factor for which the bad outcome occurs, divided by the percentage without the risk factor for which the outcome occurs, minus 1 times 100%. So as we saw in the previous example, the relative increase in colon cancer death for obese people is 50%. But we're also interested in the relative decrease in risk of some bad outcome if a risk factor is removed. And that's defined slightly differently. Here, it's 1 minus the percentage without the risk factor for which the outcome occurs divided by the percentage with the risk factor for which the outcome occurs. So the relative decrease in risk of colon cancer deaths if a person becomes non-obese, and that's 1 minus 2 over 3 times 100, which is 33%, and that's different. So the relative decrease in risk when you remove the risk factor is different from the relative increase in risk with the risk factor. Now, equivalently, there are some factors, non-obesity in our example is one, that can reduce the risk of some bad outcome. So in general, the relative decrease in risk of the outcome, if that good factor is present, is just 1 minus the percentage with the factor, so that would be with non-obesity, for which the outcome occurs, divided by the percentage without the good factor for which the outcome occurs. And in medical studies, the effectiveness of a treatment for a bad disease outcome is normally measured as the relative risk decrease of the outcome with the treatment. So in other words, effectiveness of the treatment is defined as 1 minus the percentage with the treatment for which the bad outcome occurs, divided by the percentage without the treatment for which the bad outcome occurs. And indeed, knowing the difference between absolute risk and relative risk is especially important when it comes to measuring the effectiveness of medical treatments. So in this case, we're going to look at the comparison for a treatment for a disease A. So let's suppose we've got a drug for a potentially fatal disease A, and we run a controlled trial of people with the disease in which some take the drug and others don't, or they take a placebo. So for those with the treatment, 2 out of every 100 with the disease die. So the absolute risk of death is 2%. And for those who don't take the treatment, take the placebo, 8 out of every 100 people with the disease die. So the absolute risk of death without the treatment is 8%. Now then, the absolute increase in risk of death for those with the disease A who are untreated is 8 minus 2, it's 6%, or equivalently, the absolute risk decrease for those with the disease who are treated is 6%. So those are equivalent. And the relative increase in risk of death for those with the disease who are untreated is 8 over 2 minus 1 times 100, which is 300%. But as we saw, the effectiveness of a treatment is usually defined as a relative decrease in risk if the treatment is taken. In other words, that's 1 minus the percent with treatment who die over the percent without treatment who die times 100%. So in this case, that's 1 minus 2 over 8 times 100, which is 75%. And of course, as we saw, that's going to be a different number from the relative increase. So we've now got 3 different measures of treatment effectiveness. We've got the absolute risk increase, which is equal to the risk decrease with and without the treatment. But we've got these 2 different relative measures, one which is the increase and one which is the decrease. It's this one, which is the one which is normally used. But interestingly, none of the 3 takes into account the proportion of people in the population who actually have the disease. If the proportion with the disease is 1 in 1,000, then 2 in 100,000 die from A with treatment compared to 8 in 100,000 without the treatment. So in the population as a whole, taking the treatment decreases the absolute risk of death by just 0.006%. And of course, that's the number which you would normally compare with the one which is published, which is this 75% decrease in risk associated with the treatment. So let's look at that example in the context of vaccine effectiveness. Suppose that 1,000 uninfected people get the vaccine. So there's our 1,000 people. And suppose that 2 of the 1,000 become infected with the virus. So there's our 2 out of 1,000. And let's consider 1,000 uninfected people who get a placebo, so they don't get the vaccine. Suppose 12 out of the 1,000 become infected with the virus. That's 1.2%. Now, as we know, effectiveness is defined as 1 minus a percent with the vaccine or infected, divided by 1 without the vaccine or with the placebo infected times 100%. And in this case, that's equal to 1 minus 2 over 12 times 100, which is 83%. So the vaccine is considered to be 83% effective. But as we know, this 83% is just a relative risk increase of infection for unvaccinated compared to vaccinated. The absolute risk increase is 1.12 minus 0.2, which is 1%. And again, very different. In fact, if just 11 of the vaccinated people, 1.1%, suffer adverse reactions as serious as the virus, then the risks of the vaccine outweigh the benefits despite being 83% effective. Now, in this example, we're going to compare the relative and absolute effectiveness for different treatments of different diseases. Now, the issue here is a very common health policy problem. If we've got limited resources, should we spend the money treating disease A or disease B? So we're going to look at separately at the treatments for disease A and for disease B. And we're going to compare the with and without treatment. So 2 out of every 100 people with disease A die, so the absolute risk of death is 2%. And for those without the treatment, 8 out of every 100 people die. So the absolute risk is 8%. So this is like the example we saw before. So treatment A effectiveness, as we already saw, was 75%. So it's a 75% relative risk decrease of death with the treatment. But suppose that 10 out of every 100 people with disease B die, so the absolute risk of death there is 10%, a lot more of those, and that without treatment, 40 out of every 100 people with the disease B die. So the absolute risk there is 40%. Now, interestingly again, treatment B effectiveness is 75% because 1 minus 10 out of 40 is 0.75 times 100 is 75%. It's exactly the same. But in comparison, the absolute risk decrease for treatment A is 6%, whereas the absolute risk decrease for treatment B is 30%. So in absolute terms, there's a 24% greater decrease in deaths for disease B compared to disease A. So treatments A and B have got exactly the same effectiveness, but very different absolute risk reductions. So in a choice between treating disease A or B, we've got to consider the population incidence rates. So let's look at 2 scenarios here. In scenario 1, they've both got the same incident rate, 1%. So the absolute risk decrease over the population is 0.06%, 0.3% respectively. And the number of lives saved per 100,000 for A is 600, for B is 3,000. So obviously, treatment B is the one to take there. But suppose the incident rate for disease A is 10 times higher, suppose it's 10%. Then the absolute risk decrease, in this case, is 0.6% with the treatment. So you're going to save 6,000 lives treating A compared to just 3,000 treating B. So treatment choice you should make there is treatment A. Finally, we're going to look at absolute and relative risk in the context of individual risk. So let's imagine a fleet of safe aircraft. So these aircraft are all fitted with some expensive safety device. And let's suppose that we know from records that there have been 10 crashes recorded in 100 million flights. So the probability an aircraft will crash on a flight is 1 in 10 million. So that's our safe aircraft. In comparison, let's look at the unsafe aircraft. So these are all the aircraft which aren't fitted with that expensive safety device. And for these, let's suppose they've recorded 20 crashes in 100 million flights. So the probability that an unsafe aircraft will crash on a flight is 1 in 5 million. So the risk twice as high as the safe aircraft. So failure to fit the safety device doubles the probability of a crash per flight. So the relative increase in risk of a crash is 100% per flight. But of course the absolute increase in risk of a crash from failure to fit the safety device is just 1 in a million. Of course those are very different. 100% relative risk increase, 1 in a million absolute increase. But what about individual risk? Well, an aircraft that never flies has a 0% risk of crashing and a 0% increased risk of crashing if it doesn't have the safety device. However we measure it, there's zero risk. Whereas an aircraft which makes 10,000 flights in its lifespan, for that, failure to fit the safety device still leads to a relative risk increase of 100% of crashing during its lifespan. But as the increased probability of a crash is now 0.001 in 10,000 flights, the absolute risk increase is 0.1%, that's 0.1%. But what about the increased personal risk of flying in planes without the safety device? So a person who flies twice a year for 10 years has an increased absolute risk of 1 in 500,000, whereas a pilot who makes 500 flights per year for 10 years has an increased absolute risk of 1 in 2,000, 0.05%. So in this example, as in all the previous ones, absolute risk makes kind of like more sense. It should certainly be used for individual risk assessment.